Welcome to today's webinar, Moving Along the EV Journey, Aligning and Planning, sponsored by Merchants Fleet. I'm Jay Cohen, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. However, if we do not get to yours, you will be contacted by email with a response after the event. Our presenters today are Hari Nayar, VP of Fleet Electrification and Sustainability, Ted Legoo, Director of ESG Innovation, and Tim Mundahl, Senior Fleet Consultant. All of them are with Merchants Fleet. Now I'll hand it over to Ted.
Thanks, Jay. So the EV revolution has begun. Revolution, that's a pretty significant term, right? Well, you don't have to venture far these days to hear about EVs. We are constantly seeing EVs in the news, from televised reports to press releases, with examples ranging from large corporate orders, such as Walmart signing an agreement to reserve 5,000 BrightDrop EV600s, to massive financial commitments like Toyota spending $35 billion on electric cars to close the gaps on rivals, to government policy drafts, such as the 12 U.S. states urging President Biden to support phasing out gas-powered vehicle sales by 2035. To government policy drafts, such as the 12 U.S. Another example we're probably all familiar with is the Super Bowl. Anyone watch that this year? I imagine a few of us, right? Did you notice how many EV ads there were? BMW, Polestar, Kia, Hyundai, and my personal favorite, GM with Dr. Evil, EVIL. Not only were there a lot, but all came with a pretty hefty price tag too, of roughly $6.5 million for a 30-second ad. The takeaway here is the EV revolution isn't coming, it's already here, and it's primed to accelerate with the help of improved technology, increased demand, and growing infrastructure and policy, all of which we're already seeing. So why, right? Why? Great question. So we're going to focus on the letter E here, arguably my favorite letter in the alphabet. So you can view E in the EVs in two very important ways. The first being electric, so we call that the standard lens, and the second being environmental, which I'll call the green lens. So starting with electric, so thinking about the standard lens here, why is the EV revolution happening? Well, one of the leading reasons is reduced cost of ownership. So reduced maintenance and fuel costs, downtime, and so on. In addition to that, increased availability and diversity of EV models. So major OEMs, think Ford and GM, and industry disruptors, think Canoo and Rivian, are gearing up their production. Now, moving to the right, if you think about environmental with a green lens, the EV revolution is happening largely because of sustainable and corporate social responsibility. It's increasingly becoming more and more important to consumers and employees alike. In addition to that, mandated corporate and governance policies are increasingly becoming the norm. So compliance with mission-critical direction and incentives and grants potentially becoming available through local and federal government. So if we dig a little bit deeper into each of these things and think about these in these two E lenses, we're going to kick it off with Hari and Tim. We're going to start us off on that first lens, so electric, really focusing on EV adoption. What I'll do today is I'll wrap up the presentation with a green lens, focusing on environmental opportunities and how ESG fits in. So with that, I will hand it off to our esteemed EV expert, Hari. Take it away, Hari.
Well, thanks, Tim. Ted, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm very encouraged to see the participant count continuously going up in the session. So, as Ted mentioned, there are multiple forces that are coming together these days to accelerate EV adoption. Practically, if you look at the audience here, everyone is here because of a vested interest in understanding about electrification. More importantly, there is not one day that goes by where you don't see anything in the news about something related to EVs, whether it is new battery technologies whether it is new plans coming up or new models being released, right? So you put all this together, the fundamental challenge that a lot of organizations, big, small, medium, of any size, that people are seeing is like, where do you start and how do you adopt and how do you plan for adoption? And that's what we're here to talk about. We've broken this down into kind of a 5-step approach. You can learn, align, plan, pilot, and adopt, and we'll step you through some of these today. It's critically important to understand the extent of learning that is necessary in this space. There is abundance of information out there, to the extent that the word abundance should be replaced by an overload. Wherever you look, there is information, factual, non-factual, opinions, polls, surveys, claims of fame, so on and so forth. Organizations come up, they produce a product, they vanish, sometimes they thrive. So how do you figure all this out? I mean, that falls under the learning category. And I want to call out a few key resources that we routinely use. I mean, there is industry associations that we're a part of, AFLA and NAFA routinely put out good publications. Automotive Fleet is another wonderful resource that provides a lot of good insights into factual details about what's happening in the EV space. Merchants has been in the leadership position for a while, and we have launched our Electrify Fleet initiative with a public-facing portal with all kinds of relatively good information up there, continuously being updated and published out. And then the AFDC energy.gov website, which is the most impartial entity that you could find, that provides information about vehicle characteristics and miles per gallon information, so on and so forth. So there is all of these resources, but it also makes sense to look at all these OEMs that are coming out, the established ones and the aspiring OEMs, and also dig a little bit deeper into what are they professing to be the core capabilities or competencies of the vehicle. The biggest challenge and the question that we consistently hear is, how do I conclude, or how do I draw a conclusion that a given EV is going to fit my needs at an application? I mean, this is the million-dollar question that any fleet manager, or for that matter, any person who's wanting to go into an EV has got to answer for himself or for his organization. And that question can only be answered if you start peeling back the layers and understanding what the core capabilities are, what is your operational requirements, who all are the stakeholders who are to be involved in making that decision to transform. Keep this in mind. Migrating to EVs is a transformation. And whether it is you're doing it on your personal level because you want to do good and you want to reduce your emissions footprint, or you want to embrace the new technology coming up, whole host of reasons that drives individuals. But from an organizational level, there can be a whole host of other reasons that Ted touched upon, societal requirements, regulatory compliance, ESG mandates, the sheer need to stay up with competition, and in some cases, showing up with the delivery van that has marketing livery on it that says, you're providing a green delivery service makes perfect sense. It gives you a leg up above competition. All of these factors, right, has to be factored into learning. So when you look at the challenge through that lens, how do you start to align all of these different stakeholders? And I kind of gave you a preview in my narrative thus far as to who all these stakeholders are. And rather than give you an example and just list out a bunch of stakeholders that you have to bring alignment to, let me walk you through a small case study that we were fortunate to lead. There's a project called Leapfrog, and we were tasked with helping an organization transform themselves and adopt EVs. The whole purpose here was, let me take a step back. It was a B2B service organization with about 66 odd ICE vehicles, no prior exposure to EVs, and their challenge was to get 15 to 20 EVs deployed as a pilot. Now keep the word pilot in your mind, because we'll come to that in a short while. The solution set that they adopted was to engage an FMC who had the capability to provide access to vehicles. And that is important these days, considering how long it takes to procure a vehicle of choice, right? If you place an order for certain vehicles today, you probably might not see it for the next 1.5 to 2 years. So finding a partner, again, part of that learning process, who has access to the inventory, has access to OEMs, has access to available resources on the continent to go get the vehicle that you want is critical. And with such a partner in place, this organization was able to go from 0 EVs to well over 20 EVs deployed in their operations, right? And what did that actually give them? You know, it was an aspirational goal to go into EVs by this entity, but in the end, once those EVs were pressed into service, what they uncovered was in about 11 months of operation, they saved well over 24 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. They did not start off with going to EVs as being the holy grail towards ESG. They did not change anything else in their operational protocols. They did not change any of their products or services being delivered to clients. But just by inserting about 20 EVs into their fleet, they realized 24 metric tons of emissions reduction. They're now contemplating expanding the EV fleet by about 2x, to go from 20 to 40 vehicles into their fleet, and also increasing the charging infrastructure deployment by roughly two times what they have. And across the board, absolutely overwhelming management support to accelerate EV adoption, not just for the senior executives in the company, but also for everybody else in the organization, right? So if you take that at face value and look at the results through an impartial lens, a major transformation has happened in this organization. They went from 0 EVs to going to about 40 plus in a span of about 13 months. That is transformation as well as you can ever hope to get. Now, in the spirit of alignment, what all functions had to be involved here? Let's take a closer look at that. Pretty much every functional organization in every functional department in that organization was touched. Finance had to be looped in. Of course, the C-suite had to sign off on this. Sustainability and innovation folks came on board. Clients and customers were thrilled to see one of their, vendors transforming to EVs that they could then learn from. This became a contagious thing. Obviously, the fleet manager was in the thick of everything, and he had to handle all of this stuff. All kinds of suppliers were to be involved. Like what type of vehicles? You can see an OEM as a supplier in this particular case. What type of chargers do you get, and how do you deploy them, and how do you operate them? Who can get these things installed for us? They had to find new suppliers and bring them on board, execute supply contracts, and get things done. Investors, they did not put direct money into this project, but being an investor-supported organization, this firm found out that their investors were thrilled to see the money that they were putting to support this organization was actually going into an ESG-centric, EV-centric cause, and then obviously procurement, right? So in a nutshell, when you think about needing to align, right, once you have learned and once you have defined a mission that, okay, we want to try to go to EVs, the next critical step in that process of transformation is really to get cross-functional alignment. If any one of these functions shown on the screen here does not attest to the cause or does not believe in the mission of transformation to EVs, you have one more obstacle that you have to overcome in that pathway. It can be overcome. It's just going to draw more time, more resources to bring those functions on board, right? So as you start thinking about transforming your operations, transforming your businesses into adopting EVs, please do keep in mind that this is never going to be a one-man or one-team show. That approach usually can only work in very, very, very small-scale operations where single function or single organizational department has enormous power across the entire function. If that is the case, yes, but in most other organizations, cross-functional alignment, cross-functional belief in the mission of converting to EVs is absolutely, absolutely critical. Now, with that said, let me hand this off to Tim Mundal, who will walk you through some of the planning steps that are required once your alignment phase is complete. So Tim, take it away, sir.
Thank you, Hari, and good afternoon, everybody. So if we jump to the next slide and you think about your plan, there are really two pathways you can take to build that plan. The first, data drives your plan. And then the second, data is really more of a guide or an input into decision-making and more of a collaborative approach to that planning process. When you look at data driving your plan, that typically leverages an external model. There are vendors and services that offer that type of plan for you. These models are very robust. They ingest all kinds of vehicle information from inventory location to fueling and telematics data, but they're also flexible and they allow you to determine how you want to assess your plan, meaning, do you want to look at it on a cost basis? Do you want to evaluate on an emissions basis? You can really hone in on how you want to do the analysis and the plan based on what your company or your organization's focus is. These models typically incorporate things like climate information, location-specific grants and incentives, infrastructure opportunities, et cetera. And then the output of that model is going to show you location-specific, asset-level EV deployments over your defined period of time, including the charging infrastructure and recommendations for that based on loads at each of your given locations. They're also going to include financial information around total cost of ownership comparisons, things you can use for your business case development or for your ROI justification. They're going to show you vehicle-level grants and incentives, location-level grants and incentives. And importantly, they're going to show you what your CO2 reduction looks like at each of those locations within that plan duration. At Merchants, we offer a product, obviously, in this arena. It's called Adopt EV. So if we focus in on using data to help guide the plan, in this path, you really leverage data and analytics in a more collaborative and consultative approach. And that helps you build out your EV plan based on your unique organizational requirements. On this page, you can see a number of different critical considerations that are part of any EV adoption plan. And the first part of that is to ensure that the EV plan is fully aligned with your company's overarching ESG goals, and that aligns with your company's culture. You need to understand what you're planning for and by what point in time you're planning for it. Now, conversely, if your organization hasn't set goals for EV adoption or emissions reduction or ESG, you can actually use the plan that you create to set those goals for your organization. You need to undertake a deep process of understanding what your internal and external barriers are going to look like. And those, again, include things like your company culture, driver behavior, use cases, and then external pressures like vehicle availability, infrastructure availability, et cetera. Once you've got that framework built for your plan, you move into the vehicle portion of your plan. And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion. As Ted talked about earlier, that landscape of EVs is changing at hyperspeed. As we plan for our EV deployment, it's imperative that we continue to learn and understand what's available today and what's coming down the pike in the future. So we build those vehicle options into our plan. With that knowledge, you've got to assess what your current operational requirements are to make sure that you're deploying an apples to apples or like for like vehicle type for the internal combustion or gas or diesel vehicle that you're going to replace within your existing fleet of vehicles. With that starting point of understanding what your EV equivalents are, you need to dig into what the capabilities and the range is for each of those vehicles. And you also need to look at utilization. You need to look at your use cases. At each of your locations, you need to understand what every vehicle's average daily range average daily mileage and maximum daily mileage are to make sure that you're not going to experience any real range anxiety when it comes to deploying electric vehicles in your fleet. And I stress the word real because one of the things I found as I've worked with clients and prospects here at Merchants is that a lot of folks really overestimate how many miles their vehicles actually travel in a given day. So when I say real range anxiety, I mean, we have evaluated and determined that these are our maximum ranges, and we should not have range anxiety being based on the vehicles that we've selected for our deployment. From that list of location-specific vehicles, where there aren't any daily range concerns, you need to look at things like terrain and climate as well. You should look at every location's average daily temperature to ensure your plan doesn't deploy a phase one electric vehicle at a location where a driver is going to experience a negative range because of extreme heat or extreme cold. And then the last part of that usage analysis is cargo impact. You need to understand how much you're potentially going to be carrying with the vehicle or what you're going to be towing with the vehicle, and how that is also going to impact that stated range of the given vehicle. So as you develop your vehicle plan and its use case, it's also important that you start thinking about charging and infrastructure at the same time. The step needs to be taken along with your vehicle plan because that can oftentimes take an immense amount of time. And you need to make sure that when you do start getting electric vehicles delivered, that you're in a position to charge them. Obviously, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a bunch of electric vehicles delivered to a specific location and not have the ability to charge them. And when you think about your charging plan, there are a couple different facets that you can consider. One is kind of a hub or home-based charging strategy where the vehicles all come back to a given location at night and can charge overnight. The second is a home charging strategy where the drivers can take the vehicles home and the vehicles can be charged overnight at the driver's home. And the last piece, the last consideration is public charging and a public charging strategy. And frankly, your strategy should probably incorporate all three, to be honest with you. And regardless of what that strategy is, you really need to understand what the public infrastructure looks like at your locations. With that, you need to know how many level 2 and 3 chargers from a public perspective are within 5 to 10 miles of each of your locations so that you can ensure that, again, if your driver starts to have range issues, that there's a place where they can stop, they can charge their vehicle, and they can get back on to their daily business. Obviously, part of that charging strategy needs to be the different types of understanding which types of chargers you want to deploy. Standard rule of thumb, the level 1 charger is kind of a trickle charge. It plugs into a standard outlet. It adds about 4 to 5 miles of range for every hour of charging. Level 2 charger is going to require a 240 volt electrical connection, and that'll add between 20 and 60 miles of range per hour of charging. And the last is DC fast charge, or sometimes called level 3 charging. These chargers are probably going to involve some type of infrastructure upgrade at each of your facilities where you would deploy them, but they add up to 175 miles of charging for 175 miles of range for 10 minutes of charging. Another area to consider is how many chargers you're going to need at each of your locations. Not every vehicle is going to return at the end of their workday with 0 battery life remaining. And there's a math equation you can use to determine, based on your charging output and your vehicle input need, how many chargers you actually need at each of your given locations to ensure that at the start of a given workday, your vehicles are fully charged. Lastly, once you've determined that plan for charging, you need to understand what your existing infrastructure looks like at every one of those locations. Does every location have sufficient electrical capacity today to support what your plan from a charging perspective is going to entail? What upgrades might be needed to that infrastructure, and who's going to do them? Is it something that you need to hire out to have work done for you? Is it incumbent on the utility themselves to make those upgrades to the external facilities? Another important facet to consider is, do you actually own the property or do you lease it? And in that case, you're going to have to get your landlord's permission to make upgrades to the building they own and potentially to the parking lot they own. And then the final area of focus when it comes to planning is understanding the financial impacts and building a business case, which includes an ROI justification for an EV deployment. We all know that EVs typically carry a higher acquisition price than their gas or diesel alternatives. You also need to, with that acquisition price, you need to incorporate any grants or incentives that you may be eligible for at each of your given locations. And you also need to understand, as Hari mentioned, you need to align with your internal stakeholders. Some of these incentives are tax benefits, and you need to make sure that your company can actually, or your organization, excuse me, can actually take advantage of those tax benefits. Because of those higher acquisition costs, you need to make sure that you're educating those in-house stakeholders about how that's going to impact their budget potentially, and how they may see those charges come through on their P&L, for example. Obviously, higher acquisition costs leads to either higher depreciation or higher lease costs, depending on how you procure your vehicles. And they need to understand that there's going to be a bit of a shift when they look at their numbers on their P&L. Obviously, with those higher acquisition costs comes a benefit, and that benefit is immensely lower cost to fuel or propel the vehicle, and lower cost to maintain and repair the vehicle. So when you think about fuel is a pretty easy equation to calculate based on your miles driven, the miles per kilowatt hour of your vehicle times your locations given charged per kilowatt hour from the utility. It's a simple math equation to determine what's going to cost you to fuel or propel that vehicle. And then we get to maintenance. And the beauty of an electric vehicle is it doesn't have an engine, it doesn't have a fuel system, it doesn't have an exhaust system, it doesn't require oil changes. Your cost estimates need to be based on the components that remain from the legacy internal combustion vehicle, and then any of those new components that are going to be present within the electric vehicle. When it comes to brakes, you can actually assume that your brakes are going to last longer than they did with your non-EV because of regenerative braking. In some cases, you also may want to factor in a shorter life for your tires. Because of the added torque of electric motors, you could see that your tires last a little less time, given or as your drivers get used to that kind of immediacy of as soon as you touch the accelerator, the vehicle goes. There's no ramp up period like there is with a gas or diesel vehicle. And certainly if you're carrying cargo or towing, that is also going to impact that tire life. Again, given that added torque that the electric motors add to the vehicle, and there will be some impact there. The last financial factor you need to think about, and it's the most challenging, honestly, it's the one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's what are the resale values of these going to look like? It's a challenge right now because there's not a lot of data points or case studies for us to leverage. There's no reams of data coming from an auction facility, et cetera, that can help us hone in on what are these vehicles actually going to be worth at the end of your given life cycle. They don't behave in the same manner as a gas or diesel vehicle because the value of that, the resale value of that vehicle is really driven by the health of its battery at the time it goes for sale. I encourage you to use whatever white papers examples you can find, make some assumptions, make some educated assumptions. One thing to keep in mind, because supply right now is limited, as you think about cycling out of one of these EVs in 3, 4, 5 years, my expectation is that demand is going to be high for that used vehicle, given the fact that not everybody has been able to procure the electric vehicle that they want and need to fulfill their plan in the near term. On top of that financial analysis of the vehicle itself or the total cost of ownership, into your business case, you need to incorporate the cost of the charging equipment and any infrastructure upgrades that you have to pay for, along with grants and incentives associated with those as well. And they do exist, so make sure you're doing your homework to understand what is available to you to help kind of buffer that cost a little bit. And one of the things I always talk to clients about here at Merchants, again, is when we're doing a total cost of ownership comparison of a gasoline or diesel vehicle to an EV, don't include the cost of the charging equipment and the TCO for the vehicle itself. That infrastructure is going to last several life cycles, meaning that you may pay for it once and use it for 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever that number is, electric vehicles that you deploy at a given site. The last part of your evaluation is you need to understand the value of the vehicles you have today. When you deploy an electric vehicle into your fleet, it makes sense that you would replace a vehicle that's ready to be replaced. It wouldn't make any sense to take a vehicle that's new or potentially upside down from a resale value perspective versus what you may owe on it. To replace that with an electric vehicle just doesn't make financial sense. So obviously you need to contemplate your replacement parameters along with what your equity position is on your internal combustion vehicles to ensure that you're replacing vehicles at the right time with an electric vehicle. So the next step in that 5-step journey toward EV adoption is piloting. Obviously, your goals with piloting are to learn, to assess, and to scale. And a lot of our clients move from their EV plan to a pilot. There are some that don't do a pilot. They just move toward adoption. They understand what they need to understand, and they're ready to go. A lot of that driven by the types of goals that their organization has set for them. The beauty of a pilot and having a great plan is that plan's going to give you the guide for how, where, what, and how many you should pilot at specific locations. I always tell clients when they contemplate a pilot it where it's going to be successful or where it has a great chance of being successful. This is as Ted and Hari have alluded to, this is a revolution that's happening and it's coming. And to continue to build that group of internal champions, pilot these things where it's going to make sense. Don't put an electric vehicle in Alaska and expect that that's going to be a great experience for that driver, who's then going to become one of your champions and spread the word on how great these electric vehicles are. As you consider a pilot, you need to think about a control group. And I always recommend, again, to our clients that are doing a pilot, that as they're putting a new EV into their fleet, that they also put a new internal combustion vehicle in at the same location at the same time, so that you've got a real apples to apples comparison for how that vehicle, that EV, is performing versus a true comparable from a vehicle, or excuse me, an ICE perspective. When you do contemplate this pilot, you need to set metrics that you can measure over the course of time. Some of those KPIs you could consider would be, what are the total cost comparisons? How much does it cost you to fuel the vehicle versus propel the vehicle on a per mile driven basis? Same metric for maintenance and repair. How much does it cost you to maintain and repair that vehicle over the term of the pilot? And then you need to set operational metrics, things that are going to matter to your business as to how that vehicle performs in pursuit of the job that it is on road to do, whether that's to deliver people from place to place, to deliver packages from place to place, to deliver a service. Determine what those metrics are and how you're going to compare them for your organization to, again, ensure that you're proving out success with this pilot. And the last piece that's just as important as all of these is driver satisfaction. You need to continually measure your driver satisfaction to make sure that they're having the best experience possible with their electric vehicles. This ongoing management, learning, and assessment from your pilot is going to allow you to learn, to assess, and to scale these vehicles over your broader EV adoption. And your end goal with this pilot is to remove as many of those barriers to success as could occur when it comes to that full-scale EV deployment within your broader organization. So the last step in that journey is, again, full EV adoption, or EVs become the rule, not the exception. And with a good plan, good pilot, you are set for success when it comes to adopting EVs within your fleet. As we discussed, that the numbers and types and battery ranges of electric vehicles changes almost on the hour. You need to stay on top of that, and you need to make sure that you're incorporating that into that plan, because there could be, or maybe, a vehicle that's purpose-built or built specifically for the usage or your use case that you need to use it for. That plan, again, is going to be a great framework for how you deploy and when you deploy electric vehicles within your fleet. But it's not the end game. You need to continue to update it because things are constantly changing. The number of vehicles, the types of vehicles, how far these things can go on a given charge, given their battery. Battery technology continues to evolve and change. EVSE continues to evolve and change. So that learning step within the process, the 5-step journey, needs to continue to happen even as you're adopting and rolling out electric vehicles within your fleet. And with that, I will pass it back to Ted.
Great. Thank you, Tim. So where does ESG fit in? Good question. So let's start with, what is it? So maybe you've heard of ESG, maybe you haven't, but my bet is you probably will soon. So what's it stand for? Elephants, seahorses, and giraffes? No, close. Environmental, social, and governance. So starting with environmental, right? So this is our planet. This is the air and landscapes we enjoy and we need to survive. So some of the things that would fall under this umbrella are electrifying fleets to reduce tailpipe emissions and installing solar panels to obtain green energy. Then if we think about social, so social is really the employees and the communities that we serve. So examples that fall under this umbrella are programs to promote diversity and inclusion, improving health and wellness, and giving back to our communities through things such as volunteering and financial donations. And then lastly, governance. So governance is really the guidance and policies that inform enterprise-level decision-making. So examples here would be information security, board and leadership diversity, and ethics and integrity policies. So that's what it stands for, and those are some of the things that fall under the umbrella, but what is it? So environmental, social, and governance, ESG, it's really the key to satisfying today's priorities with tomorrow's in mind. So combined with existing business strategy, ESG reveals risks and opportunities that will impact a company's ability to create value for our planet, for our people, for our communities, and our business alike. So in summary, it's really a lens that reveals risks and opportunities to not only benefit the world, but businesses alike. So what? So what, right? Why does it matter? Well, speaking of acronyms, what's the biggest one you hear in corporate America today, especially at the executive level? Spoiler alert, it's ESG, as you probably guessed. The impact of integrating ESG with existing corporate strategy extends far beyond the inherent environmental, social, and governance benefits. The world is rapidly changing, and with it causing tremendous shifts in client, investor, and employee sentiment. Viewing business strategy through an ESG lens prepares you to mitigate financial risks and enhances your ability to engage with stakeholders who are increasingly measuring success in new and meaningful ways. The opportunity to do good while simultaneously doing well as a company is great. And it's a really exciting time. It's a really, really exciting time. It's an exciting time in the world of business and sustainability. And the key here is not to view the two as mutually exclusive, as some may have in the past, but rather to view business and sustainability as complementary, so supporting one another's success. So the big takeaway here is to do well as a company, you must do good, especially these days. If you have one takeaway from ESG today, it is this: to do well, you must do good. So where does fleet fit in? So transportation accounts for roughly 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. So EVs are one of the most effective solutions in fighting pollution, especially at scale. So think fleet. 1 in 5 vehicles you see on the road today is part of a fleet. That's a transitioning fleets as a whole from ICE or gas and diesel to EV vehicles have a tremendous, tremendous opportunity to curb emissions while simultaneously achieving ESG strategies and in turn satisfying evolving stakeholder demands. So petrol, gas versus electric, that's just one additional thing I want to add. I'd like to address a question that might pop up and to create full transparency. That question is, aren't we just shifting the emissions from the tailpipe of our ICE vehicles to the smokestacks of our EVs through electricity generation? The short answer is no. Electricity generation, though not 100% perfect, is cleaner today compared to its gas and diesel counterparts and will continue to get cleaner as more green technology is deployed, such as through wind and solar. So again, the takeaway here is there is a tremendous opportunity for fleet as a whole to combat greenhouse gas emissions through EV adoption, while at the same time satisfying ESG and sustainability strategies that serve a continuously evolving stakeholder demand, a demand that is requiring more and more and more and more from companies to be good stewards of the environment. And with that, that concludes this webinar. I know we've gone through a lot over the past, it's already been 40 minutes. So I'm going to pass it back to Jay to help field any questions that you might have. But in the meantime, thank you. We really, really appreciate the opportunity to take part in this forum today. And I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do have some time remaining, like you said. So there were a bunch of questions that came in. I can dive right in and we'll get these answered. First question, I believe, is Tim. This one's for you. How does an organization decide between the data as a driver versus data as a guide approach?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, something that I get asked a lot. I typically look at that under 2 different lenses. I think the first one is, what is your organization's culture, and which of those approaches is going to work better for your culture? And I think the other thing to think about is, how aggressive are your sustainability or your electrification targets. If you've got some steep targets to meet in a short period of time, it probably makes sense to use more of the data-driven approach to ensure that you get those vehicles on the road as quickly as possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question, I believe, Ted, this one would be for you. How do I best work with the sustainability team at my organization? I haven't interacted with them very much. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say create common ground or align. I think that would be step number 2 in our 5-step adoption process. Good pop quiz there for me. But what I mean by align is to align behind a shared vision of what success looks like and ultimately why it matters. Also, always assume good intent. In all likelihood, both parties want to do what is best for the organization overall. And it really is about doing good in a way that enables the company to do well. So if you both go into an EV project with a shared vision, it really enables effective collaboration and in turn sets you up for efficiency as well.
Okay, that's a lot of good information there. Let's move on to another question. I think, Harry, this one might be best suited for you. They're asking, we're at the learning phase, but still are having a hard time digesting all the information, moving beyond that initial phase. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, this is a common problem that we find a lot of our clients in. You are learning, you're actually being bombarded with a lot of information. And sometimes you question, are you actually learning or are you sinking in this information puddle? The right step is to first take a look and try to identify, is there a mission statement that can be derived, or what is the appetite within the organization to transform to EVs, right? Keep in mind, you are going to have to transform certain aspect of how you operate or how you bring these vehicles into service. There is transformation that is needed. So understanding what is the appetite, what is the time frame to that transformation will help you create the alignment that is needed within the organization. To break it down further, let's assume your C-suite wants EVs deployed tomorrow, whereas the fleet manager wants it to be done only after he or she retires. You do not have an aligned vision there, right? You have disparate relationship. It is that alignment across the organization that actually will help propel you from the learning phase to what I think is most important is pilot. If anybody comes to us and says, I want to go 100% to EVs tomorrow morning, I think we would caution them to say, why don't we do a consolidated pilot, learn, and then refine your plan? So that needs to be your approach there.
Okay, thank you for that, Harry. Next question, I think this one is for Tim. They're asking if the company also provides consulting services on the specific EVs relevant to the duty cycle of the fleet manager in terms of TCO and things like that.
Can you repeat that question?
Sure, and maybe hopefully I'm reading it correctly. It says, do you also provide consulting services on the specific EV relevant to the duty cycle of the fleet manager in terms of TCO, et cetera?
Yeah, exactly. That's frankly a major part of my role, is to provide those consulting services to understand the duty cycle, to understand the vehicle that needs to be deployed within a given constraint, and then make recommendations on what those different types of electric vehicles could be.
Okay, great. Next question, I think, Harry, this one, back to you for this one. Weight impacts an EV range is what they're implying. So does it impact an ICE vehicle in the same magnitude, or is this something unique about EVs? And then they ask another follow-up, does this matter only because charging time is so slow?
Great question. The short answer, if you look at it from a pure physics standpoint, is excess weight affects miles per gallon on an EV, miles per gallon on an ICE vehicle, sorry, and excess weight affects watt hours per mile that you get on an EV. If you want to look at this through the lens of energy density, right? Gasoline roughly is about, say, 47 megajoules per kilogram. A battery is about 0.3 megajoules per kilogram. So gasoline, roughly, rough ballpark, is about 100 times more energy dense. Because of that, the sensitivity to weight on a gasoline vehicle may not be as apparent as sensitivity to weight on an EV. In other words, if you have excess weight on an EV, you will probably see very quickly a degradation in range, and not a permanent degradation, but achievable range for that particular charging session, much more than you would see on an ICE vehicle. If you want to look at this deeper, just take a look at tractor trailers, right? Tractor trailers, once they're fully loaded, your miles per gallon tanks. If they're not loaded, your miles per gallon goes up. So there is impact to both ICE and EVs, but with present-day battery technology, the effects will be seen more on an EV. It really doesn't have much direct impact from the speed of charging. Obviously, if you're on a long-haul route and you're hauling a lot of cargo, if you have to stop periodically to charge, then that changes the dynamic of how you're operating. So there is a slight dependency there, but there's not a direct correlation of charging speeds.
Okay. I think I have another one for you, Hari. What is the approximate cost of purchasing and installing a DC fast charger, and what is the timetable for installation?
That's an interesting one. The cost, you got to break it down into two aspects. There is a cost of the equipment, just the physical charger that needs to go into the ground, and then there is a make-ready aspect of infrastructure that can support that charger's operation. Both those numbers can vary significantly. A rule of thumb, generally speaking, you can get DC fast chargers anywhere from about $20,000 to $45,000 just in the equipment. That range, again, it's a pretty wide range that I mentioned there. Depends on the power, the specifications. Do you want a single cabinet design? What type of cooling systems are needed, so on and so forth. That changes the hardware costs. The make-ready cost of it can actually be a very significant number. It could be anywhere from, a simple $5,000 concrete pad installation and you mount on top of it, if you have electrical capacity to support that specific hardware at your location, or it can be well over $100,000 if you have to bring in, new service and new transformers and new feeds. It's an area that I would encourage, everybody who's listening in here to pay close attention to. There is no one formula that's going to tell you this is the absolute number that you should shoot for. But keep in mind, as power numbers for DC fast charging goes up, the odds are very likely that you will need to get extra grid capacity brought into that place to support that level of operation, which will drive up your make-ready aspect of costs.
Hari, it's Tim. I'd like to ask a follow-up question. When you think about DC fast charging, do you believe it should be the exception rather than the rule, given the impact it actually has on the battery health?
I don't think I would see it as an exception versus a rule. I mean, there is a clear necessity for DC fast charging based on operational needs, right?
Right.
And the battery technology, the degradation that you see on batteries happens only if it is extremely high power DC fast charging only repeatedly over the life of the battery. That typically doesn't happen unless in very, very, very niche cases. So this is why I didn't want to use the term that it is an exception or a rule. You have to weigh in where a DC fast charger makes sense. A lot of folks have come to us and come to me and said, I want to go in with DC fast chargers because I want to cycle my vehicles out. But when we do the analysis for that particular fleet, the fleet is idling for 4 to 6 hours on a day, right? So you are actually going to save a lot of money, a lot of infrastructure costs, a lot of heartburn by not deploying a DC fast charger, but sizing your deployment for the maximum power capable level 2 chargers, right? So it again falls into that learning alignment category there too.
Right.
Okay. question, I think this one is best for Ted. What are some resources to stay informed on the technology like EVs, infrastructure, battery types, and the battery qualities, things like that?
Phew, I was afraid I wasn't going to get a question. Well, Automotive Fleet and Bobbit, of course. But in addition to that, just looking back at slide 7 here that we have, there's AFLA as well, and then industry publications such as Charged Fleet, Automotive Fleet, which I've mentioned, NAFA, and of course, Electrify Fleet and EV Finder, a recent tool that we actually developed, are all great resources to check out.
Okay, that's very helpful. And then another question, this one for Tim. Do you expect residual values on EVs to improve over the next 2 to 5 years? How are you approaching the concern of not knowing the residual values on EVs?
Yeah, that's a great question. You may get a different response if you ask somebody else. I actually do think the residual values are going to improve over the next couple of years. And again, it gets back to what I spoke about earlier, that the number of pre-orders and orders that the OEMs received for specific vehicle types, right? Like the Ford F-150 Lightning. The number of orders they've received far exceeds what they can produce. So I think there's going to be a ton of demand for these used electric vehicles in the short term. That's going to keep those values actually fairly high. Probably not as high as what we're experiencing today with the shortage of new vehicles. But again, I do think the resale curve is going to look different than it looks for a Nissan Leaf today, for example. I do believe, given that demand, specifically for vocational vehicles, that it is going to cause those residual values to come out of the gate higher than, I would say, maybe a standard vehicle.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer, that information. And just want to say that's all the time we have for today's presentation, and just want to thank all the participants. There were lots of questions asked, and unfortunately we couldn't get to all of them. So I just want to remind everyone that anyone who asked a question that wasn't answered, the Merchants Fleet team will be following up via email to answer your question individually. So you will be getting a response to your question if it wasn't answered over the webinar today. We hope that you all enjoyed the webinar, and I want to again thank Hari, Ted, Tim, and Merchants Fleet for today's presentation. And I want to remind everyone that the webinar will be available on demand on the Automotive Fleet website at automotivefleet.com/webinar. Thank you, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.